Now that we've completed a basic introduction to some concepts, we will start reviewing specific brain areas and how lesions in those areas can lead to various types of pathophysiology and clinical presentations. Now, the key to approaching this information is to think about what the brain is normally doing in a specific region. And then you can think, well, what would happen if this brain region could no longer do what it normally does? Now, granted, the level at which we will discuss these various structures in the brain is extremely simplified, but it provides a good basis and enough information to answer pretty much all the questions you'll see on step 1. So here we see a cartoon of the brain that highlights some very important subcortical brain regions. Let's start by zooming in on a small region that plays a very big role in behavior. That region is the hypothalamus. Now, it's a really complicated region because it secretes so many different hormones and neuropeptides. However, for step 1, it helps to know all the roles that the hypothalamus plays in regulating behavior. This is a really long list, but we can go through it rather quickly. And so the hypothalamus works with the pituitary to maintain homeostasis by mediating thirst and water balance. It mediates hormone release from both the anterior as well as the posterior pituitary. It's involved in mediating hunger and satiety, autonomic regulation, things like the circadian rhythm. Then it regulates temperature and sexual urges and emotions. And so you see, there's a really large array of behaviors that are under the control or are mediated in some way by the hypothalamus. One good mnemonic to help you remember this is tan hats. And now the hypothalamus can be divided into major regions along the anterior, posterior, and the medial-lateral axes. The supraoptic nucleus is responsible for making ADH, which induces the kidneys to reabsorb more water. And do you remember where ADH binds to induce the kidney to reabsorb water? That would be the V2 receptors, which are found on principal cells. The paraventricular nucleus makes the hormone oxytocin, which mediates smooth muscle contractions in the uterus and breast during labor and breastfeeding, respectively. The suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is right above the optic chiasm, which is how it gets its name, suprachiasmatic. This is responsible for mediating the sleep-wake cycles based on the amount of light entering the retina. This information then is relayed to the pineal gland, which produces melatonin. This is the hormone that is partially responsible for the sleep-wake cycle. Now, the lateral and the ventromedial areas of the hypothalamus are involved in controlling appetite. The lateral area causes feelings of hunger, while the ventromedial does the opposite. It controls feelings of satiety. Leptin is a hormone that is secreted by adipose cells, which inhibits the lateral area and activates the ventromedial area. So what would be the effect of leptin release? Well, let's think about it. If leptin inhibits the area that causes feelings of hunger and activates the area that causes feelings of satiety, then it will cause a lack of appetite. Well, I'm sure you can also then figure out what happens if you had a lesion in one of these areas. Well, a lesion in the lateral area would lead to a lack of desire to eat, while a lesion in the ventromedial area would lead to uncontrolled eating. Now, the anterior hypothalamus detects increased body temperature and then activates mechanisms to dissipate heat, things like sweating. The posterior hypothalamus does the opposite. It wants to conserve heat. There are a few nice mnemonics in your book that should help you to memorize what these regions do. Now remember, the hypothalamus is really important in terms of regulating behavior, so you really want to be able to understand what the different regions of the hypothalamus do and how they're able to do those things. In our discussion of the hypothalamus, we briefly discussed its role in regulating sleep behavior. So now let's go into more detail about this. The sleep cycle, which we will discuss in detail, is regulated by the circadian rhythm. This is driven by the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Now, the suprachiasmatic nucleus is regulated by environmental light cues. It receives these inputs from the retina via the retino-hypothalamic tract. Now, it can then release norepinephrine, which stimulates the pineal gland to release melatonin, which will then induce drowsiness. The SCN also regulates the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone as well as prolactin. In light of what I just said, it makes a lot of sense that melatonin supplements can be used as a sleeping aid. Interestingly, melatonin supplements are not associated with the dependence and withdrawal that characterizes most other sleep aids. Sleep can be divided into two main stages: REM or rapid eye movement sleep, as well as non-REM sleep. REM sleep is characterized by extraocular movements. And that makes sense, right? Because it's called rapid eye movement. The extraocular movements that are seen in REM sleep are due to the paramedian pontine reticular formation, or PPRF. This is also known as the conjugate gaze center. During the sleep cycle, REM sleep occurs every 90 minutes and increases in duration throughout the course of the night. Now, what is the principal neurotransmitter involved in REM sleep? This is a neurotransmitter we spoke about earlier. It is involved in a number of different processes in the brain and body, including slowing the heart rate. The answer is acetylcholine. Now let's delve a little bit deeper into the stages of sleep. This is a fairly high-yield topic, and you should be very comfortable with the various EEG waveforms associated with the different stages of sleep. In the clinical setting, reading an EEG is a nuanced exercise that takes experience. So if you get a question with an EEG on the exam, there will usually be a fairly obvious clue either in the question stem or in the EEG itself. To begin, let's discuss what the EEG looks like when someone is awake, so we'll have a point of comparison for sleep. And obviously this picture is of a gentleman who is undergoing an EEG process. Now you can think of the frequency of an EEG as correlated with the activity of the neurons in the brain. Thus, when you are awake, you might expect the most activity on an EEG, and while you are asleep, you might expect decreased activity. The exception for this is during REM, as we will discuss. So, when someone is awake, his eyes are open. The EEG waveform observed is a beta waveform. This sort of waveform has the highest frequency and lowest amplitude. However, when someone is awake but their eyes are closed, you see an alpha waveform. Now, in the first stage of non-REM sleep, which is the lightest stage and comprises about 5% of total sleep time in young adults, the EEG waveform observed is a theta waveform. Now, we talked about acetylcholine in terms of its importance for REM sleep, but which neurotransmitter is critical for initiating sleep? The answer is serotonin, and it is released from the dorsal raphe. In the second stage of non-REM sleep, which comprises about 45% of total sleep time in young adults, you will begin to see sleep spindles and K complexes on the EEG waveform. This stage of sleep is when grinding of the teeth and clenching of the jaw occurs, referred to as bruxism. Now, the third stage of non-REM sleep comprises about 25% of total sleep time in young adults. Here you see the delta waveform, which has both the lowest frequency as well as the highest amplitude. Stage 3 is the deepest stage of sleep, and this is the sleep stage when episodes of sleepwalking, night terrors, and bedwetting occur. So we have sleepwalking, night terrors, and bedwetting. This is also known as enuresis. So how would you treat these three things: sleepwalking, night terrors, and bedwetting? Okay, so benzodiazepine is useful for treating night terrors as well as sleepwalking, whereas imipramine is useful for treating bedwetting, and this is because it decreases stage 3 sleep. However, you should also know that desmopressin, which is an ADH analog you should be familiar with from renal, is actually preferred to imipramine because it doesn't have any of the adverse side effects imipramine does. REM sleep comprises about 25% of total sleep in young adults. The EEG waveform observed is the beta waveform, which is the same waveform as that observed during which period? The period when you were in an awake and alert state. So we see a beta waveform both in awake and alert state as well as in REM sleep. So this is why REM sleep is actually sometimes known as paradoxical sleep. REM sleep occurs approximately every 90 minutes and its duration increases throughout the night. It is characterized by dreaming, loss of motor tone, erections, and increases in brain oxygen usage. This is possibly related to a memory processing function. Also, as we discussed, extraocular movements during REM sleep are due to the activity of, do you remember? The PPRF, paramedian pontine reticular formation. Now you also will see an increased and variable pulse. You'll see variance in blood pressure as well as penile and clitoral erection. So although REM is the fourth stage of sleep, it seems like a lot of things are going on here. And that explains why the EEG waveform resembles that of the awake state. A great mnemonic to help remember all of the changes seen in the EEG during the sleep cycle is, at night, bats drink blood. And you can see that BAT stands for beta, alpha, theta, sleep spindles. Then you have delta and beta, and you're basically just going through the stages of sleep. And one thing that helps me to remember REM is just think of sex, right? If you think of sex and REM together, you probably remember all the things you see, right? Variance in blood pressure, increased pulse, penile, clitoral erection, anything that deals with a lot of activity while you're sleeping, attribute that to the REM stage. Alright people, it's time for another flash quiz. What is the major neurotransmitter implicated in REM sleep? Now this is one you should definitely remember. It is acetylcholine.